All right. Welcome to Making Bricks in Colonial and Early Republic Maryland. Dr. Jim Gibb is our speaker tonight. And when you're ready, Jim, you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, I'm good to go. Um, just a quick commercial first. Next month, I'll be talking about a roughly 5,000-year-old Native American site. There will not be a talk in December. Everybody's too busy partying. But I hope we'll begin again in January as soon as I send Allison my three prospective talks for the first quarter of next year. So anyway, yeah, the subject tonight is making bricks. And I'll touch on a little bit of the later stuff, but mostly I'm focused on uh, kind of handmade bricks, the colonial and early republic periods. Uh, I could do another talk just on the later stuff, particularly the machine-made bricks. And I could do a talk just on identifying different kinds of bricks, how you could figure out how a brick was made, and thereby how old it is. But that's just too much for one night. So we'll just stick with the basics for now. So I have a couple of text slides to remind me. But steps in brick making, you'll actually see this slide several times as I move back and forth between images and my prompts here. But in order to make bricks, you need material. You need, and we'll call it clay, but it really isn't clay. For brick making, you'll use a clay loam or a loam or even a silt loam. Pure clay, the sort of stuff you might make ceramics out of, is what they call fat clay. When it's drying, it will warp. When you fire it, it will warp and crack. Just straightforward clay is not used in making bricks. So, where do you get this stuff from? Well, in some of these large brick manufacturing areas, like the upper Hudson River around Albany, they just massive beds. They're essentially open pit mines where they quarry this material. And that's exactly the kind of brick making I am not talking about tonight. Most of the clay material we're talking about is, let me go back to that for a moment. If you want to build a foundation for a house, brick foundation, or maybe you want an entire cellar underneath your house, you need to excavate. So you dig a hole. Well, more often than not, the material that comes out of that hole or out of that trench for a foundation is suitable for brick making. So you pile it up and you let it sit out in the weather over the winter. And you let the organics break down. You pull out some of the stone, bits of gravel and whatnot, and you just try to clean it up. But it sits out and weathers over the winter. After that, it's sometimes tempered. If it's too clay, the brickmaker will add sand to it. And so what they do is they dump the clay, again, I use that term advisedly, into what's called a pug mill, P-U-G. And it uses any number of different kinds of motive power, but basically it's a mill that you put the clay in and add your tempering material, which is generally sand. This is an example of one under a shed. And the idea of the shed is going to come up kind of often this evening because all this work is done outdoors. But the problem with making bricks and laying them out to dry and even building a kiln with them is that they're subject to the weather, especially in the mid-Atlantic where summer storms can be fierce. If it pours rain all over your green bricks before they've been fired, they're going to turn into mud. So it makes sense to have some sort of shelter over the various staging areas for making bricks. So in here is a pug mill. Here's a drawing that maybe makes it a little clearer. You could see just right of center, there's a horse at a mill, and that horse is tied to a sweep. So that horse walks around in circles and is spinning a vertical shaft to which are attached generally wooden, but they could be metal paddles. And it's just sort of a blender, a slow moving blender. And it just mixes the clay. It gives it, makes it more homogeneous in texture. And of course, you can mix in whatever temper may be necessary. Here's a more recent photograph of one. Again, you've got, I think that's a mule actually, but a draft animal tied to a sweep. And then you have some cylindrical container in which you throw the clay and work it up. And then, as necessary, add sand. The next step is in molding the clay into something we would consider a brick. And usually that's done with wooden molds, and you, by hand, you pack clay into those molds, and then you strike off the excess before you empty it from the mold. So there were machines developed. A lot of the machinery was starting to develop around 1840s, mostly for military installations. But throughout the 19th century, people developed and patented all kinds of machines that would mold bricks. And in the case of the one on the left-hand side, actually it's attached to a pug mill, so it milled the clay and then pressed it into bricks. But this is more like what we're going to be looking at for the colonial and early republic periods. It's just a very simple mold, looks like a ladder, except there's a back to it. The pieces of wood in between these spars here, this interior wood, more often than not, it's just a flat piece of wood, but it also can have an impression. For instance, the name of your brick company, or it could have just sort of a prismatic piece of wood sticking up that would leave an impression in a brick, something we call a frog. I'll get to that in a moment. And you can also put a shaped piece of wood into the mold. So when you push the clay in, you're shaping it, you're creating a particular shape. And a shape like this would be used for what's called a water table around the top of a foundation that you'll see on a lot of 18th century plantation houses. Oh, just did that. Next, okay, so here's molding the brick. So you packing that soil in, you strike it off, and then you turn the mold upside down to get the brick out. Typically, you would have some sort of lubrication on the wooden mold so the brick comes out quickly and easily, and so it doesn't twist and warp as you're trying to push it out of the mold. Typically, especially around here, those molds would be just covered with sand, the way you would throw cornmeal on a counter when you're rolling out bread dough or pizza dough. And that sand would be enough to provide the lubrication to easily extract the green brick, the unburned brick. Some people used water, and Thomas Jefferson was a leader in using oil. He actually had his brickmaker oil the molds. And so when you look at some of the buildings that were built by Thomas Jefferson, for instance, the University of Virginia, you can see those bricks have a particularly smooth and even appearance. And that's a product of using oil for lubrication. Here's an image of these folks. You know, they're just, again, it's sort of a ramada or shelter under which they're working that protects the work. But you can see they're laying out these green bricks in the center of the image. Once you've molded the brick, you have to dry it. Now, the trick to making good bricks and to make them fast is to avoid putting water into the mix. So, you know, if you can work the clay in a pug mill and have it at a consistency where you do not have to add water, that's better, because the more water you add, the more water has to leave the brick before it's fired. So you can have, it takes longer to dry the brick. For those of you who worked in archaeology labs, you know, don't soak the artifacts, right? You pick up an artifact, you wet it, you brush it, but you don't dump all the artifacts into a basin of water so they can absorb water, because it just takes them longer to dry when you're done. Well, it's the same with bricks. You want to avoid adding water, and if you're going to add it, put as little as possible in it. So You empty the green bricks from the molds, you lay them out. Maybe it's just out on the ground or on some wooden pallets. Preferably, it's some sort of shelter again, because if it rains, you're screwed. Uh, and then those bricks, as they dry, are what they call hacks. That is, they're stacked on their long edges, so there's maximum surface area, so they can dry evenly. Again, if you use a fat clay that's untempered, really clay stuff, as the brick dries, it's going to crack and it's going to twist because the outside clay dries more quickly than the interior. So you want to put enough temper in the brick so moisture quickly and easily escapes through the green brick, so it dries more or less evenly. In later periods, they actually had ovens in which they would push the brick and heat dry the brick to do it more quickly and more evenly, so they get a better quality, more even brick. Also, from those heating ovens, they can go directly into a kiln for firing. But this is probably more typical of what we saw in the mid-Atlantic region, where they're simply laying them out on the ground. I don't know where this photograph was taken, but it might be a relatively arid area. But this would be unwise around here if you had any inkling that it might rain. The next step in making the kinds of bricks we're talking about early in this period is we're going to actually build the kiln out of green brick. That is, we're not using a kiln that's made of brick and then we put green brick inside of it. We're actually building the kiln with unfired bricks. And that kind of kiln is referred to as a clamp. In terms of height, numbers I see run around 42 courses, that is 42 layers of brick high. And a kiln, it'll have usually at least two channels for fuel, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But it could have many. A small kiln might produce a few thousand to 20,000 bricks. Larger kilns, 40 to even 100,000 bricks at a time. That may sound like a lot, but especially for some of these 18th century brick mansions we have around here, they probably use several 100,000 bricks. So here, these guys are building a brick clamp with green bricks. At least I think that's what they're doing. Alternatively, the clamp has already been fired and they're disassembling it. It's not at all clear from the image. And so here you get a first look at one of these clamps look like in the center of the image. Down towards the bottom is sort of a dark triangular area. This is the channel into which fuel is placed. And it's an arch and it runs clear through the clamp. So it could be fueled from both sides and the air comes in from both sides. These things are usually built through a corbelled arch. That is, they just stack the bricks, but make sure they come closer and closer together until they hit the top. And then they get a flat area, and then they build the rest on top of that. These chambers, once the fire is going to the brick burner's satisfaction, they would install what they called a shin log. Shin as in the lower part of your leg, log as in wooden log. I don't know where the term comes from, but it could be a large stone, a large brick, a whole bunch of bricks set in mud, but basically they plugged up each end of that channel. Because if you let air continue to come in, the fire burns hotter and hotter and hotter, much hotter than perhaps you want, eventually melting the bricks. Here's a relatively contemporary image of a brick clamp. I guess this is East Africa, but you can see they've built, actually you can't see chambers. Maybe these are the shin locks here. These piles of brick may close up the channels. But they've built the kiln, the clamp, out of green brick, and then they plaster the whole thing with earth. Or around here, I think more often than not, they just shoveled soil on top of this whole thing. And the point of that, there's a couple of things going on there. First, they keep the heat within the clamp necessary. The other thing is they also limit the amount of oxygen that can get in. Again, if you let too much oxygen get into the clamp, the fire will burn very hot and uncontrollably and will turn the whole thing basically into a molten mass. And so all that effort is wasted. You just got a big pile of burned bricks that have fused together and are quite useless. And then finally, you disassemble the clamp after it's fired, usually for several days, and they allow it several days to cool down. But you disassemble that clamp, and then you sort the bricks by grade. You get what is sometimes referred to as clinker bricks or arch bricks, which are really overly sintered, sort of being vitrified or melted. And most of you, at least those of you who work in archaeology, have seen over-sintered bricks. That is, bricks that are kind of dense and have a purplish color to them, and they're kind of shiny on the outside. I mean, they look like they're really heavily overfired. And they have their purposes, and I'll finish this evening with some pictures about how you can use those bricks. But what we're looking for really are nice red bricks that are uniformly burned. They're not over-centered. They're not. They're even. They're not twisted. They're not cracked. They're just good building material. And then finally, you get what are called salmon brick, and salmon refers to the color. That is, there's sort of a light yellowish red color. They're not sufficiently fired. They're friable. They will crumble easily. They can be used in some kinds of construction where you don't need a great deal of load-bearing capability, but you certainly don't want them exposed to the weather because they'll wash away. And in a moment, I'll show you an example of how you can use salmon brick. So here's an 1893 photograph showing a very large brick clamp being disassembled after it's been burned. And again, you can see it's under this huge shelter, which makes a lot of sense because a brick clamp that size represents a huge amount of labor and material, and you don't want to bugger it up in a thunderstorm. So let's look at a couple of manifestations of this brick making. First of all, I have this quote from Ivor Noel Hume, who is one of the granddaddies of American historical archaeology. He did most of his work down at Williamsburg. He really brought science to archaeology down there, although he wouldn't phrase it quite that way. He was a Brit, came here in the 1950s, and if you look at some old issues of National Geographic and such, you'll see pictures of him and the kind of neat things they were finding back then. But here's his quote. "There is little that can usefully be said about the archaeological relics of brickmaking, other than to add my personal opinion that, of all the features one could find, a brick clamp, a kiln or clamp, is probably one of the most arduous to excavate and the least interesting. It tells us nothing about the purpose to which the bricks would ultimately be put, and the chances of finding any datable artifacts in association with it, the clamp, are remote." End quote. And this is in really the first textbook in historical archaeology. Now, I disagree with this. As in most archaeological sites, it depends on the questions. Do you have interesting questions to ask of a particular kind of feature or site? If you don't, it almost doesn't matter what it is. It's probably going to be kind of boring. I think there are interesting questions to ask about brick kilns or clamps, and I'll mention some of those as we go along. But I think there is value in excavating these features. I'm not sure it's necessary to excavate them in their entirety. Here's a pretty large brick kiln at Jamestown. And we call it a kiln because it appears to have been made of burned brick. And so you stack the green brick inside of it. But it's still basically the same concept. This one is actually dug into the ground which isn't common of brick clamps that we see in this region anyway. They appear to have been built pretty much on the surface of the ground. But you can see the fire channels. They go, actually, this one, they don't seem to go all the way through, or maybe they didn't excavate the near side of this thing. Um, you can make a brick clamp or kiln just so wide. I mean, because you got to be able to get fuel in there. So even if those channels can't be more than say 20 feet. If you load wood from each side, if it's more than 20 feet wide, you're not going to be able to get the wood in there and distribute it evenly. So the limit on the width of these things is roughly 20 feet. In terms of length, you could stretch them from Annapolis to Los Angeles if you want. If you got enough material and people and whatnot, you could just keep adding channels. I'm not sure there's any physical constraints, theoretical physical constraints on how long these things could be. And the importance of that is it means you can make a lot of bricks at one time if you have the people and material to do it. And as I said, with these large 18th century mansions, they're using hundreds of thousands of bricks just for the building, never mind outbuildings and other features. In Maryland, in Hughesville, actually, there was a brick clamp that was excavated for the State Highway Administration. And it was found through just shovel testing. They were shovel testing an area and started hitting charcoal and lots of deteriorated brick. And when you find those two things and virtually nothing else, that suggests you have a brick clamp. You have a site where somebody's burning brick. If you start finding all kinds of domestic refuse, ceramics and glass and other architectural materials like nails and glass, and you probably have a building. If there's charcoal, it's probably burned. But if it's just brick, rubble, and charcoal, it's probably a brick clamp. So they've exposed a good part of this thing, and you can see just to the right of this guy here, you can see there's a channel, and next to that is a bench, and then another channel and another bench, and that's really the pattern we see up at Whitehall, just near Annapolis. Years ago at the Lost Towns of Anne Arundel project, we dug a brickyard that was probably from Governor Horatio Sharp when he built his mansion at Whitehall. I think we had seven separate clamps. A couple of them may have overlapped a little bit, and it looks like several of them were reused. The same spot was reused. So what we find on these things tends to be one or two courses of brick representing these benches that's kind of overfired or underfired, and this becomes the base for another batch of bricks rather than being collected for bricks to be used in construction. These two women mapped the feature. I just came by as a visitor, and I was looking at them kind of struggling, trying to communicate with one another. I said, if you just draw a sketch of this thing first, identify a few points and put some flags in the ground what those points are, it'd be a lot faster and easier. They looked at me like I had three heads. I think they just thought I was some, local busybody. Maybe I was, I don't know. But here's another view of it. You'll notice how the bricks are laid out in these benches. The brickyard, the brick clamps we excavated up at Whitehall actually had more of a chevron pattern to it, or fishbone pattern. So the bricks are angled. What the advantage of that might have been, I don't know. In St. Mary's City, years ago, Ned Height had found the remains of a brick clamp near what became the new dormitories. And here in this drawing, you can see just had a bit of it here, but you could see the alternating brick rubble and charcoal that represented the benches and channels for that clamp. And one I worked on pretty much when I first came to Maryland, there's a church, Christ Church in Port Republic, which is near St. Leonard in the center of Charles County. And the Patterson Park and Museum heard about some excavations underneath the church that exposed some human remains, not surprising. And so I volunteered with the assistant regional archaeologist at the time, Stu Reeve, and we've been out there, and you could see these gray areas, these stippled areas underneath the church, which I memory serves dated to 1753. I don't know if I, oops, I don't know if I put that anywhere on this drawing here. Oh, bugger. Anyway, you can see the dark areas. These are grave shafts. And when these guys were trenching through to put in an HVAC system, I think it was, they went right through a whole bunch of graves, and that's what you see here. But also at the entrance that they knocked through the foundation, we found the remains of brick clamps. And I'm afraid I don't have pictures of this, but the footer for this church, so the basic support system for the brick foundation that supported the church. Well, underneath that, they had a footer, a wide footer, and that footer was made up of mortar and brick rubble from the brick clamps. So all that underfired brick and brick that broke or was overfired just got mixed in with water, became essentially like a concrete base upon which the brick foundation was built. So it is one of the purposes to which damaged bricks can be put. I just pulled this stuff out of my personal notes a week or so ago. I've never done nice digital drawings of it, but this is my field drawing, looking at the side of a trench, and you can see the dark black stuff obviously is charcoal, and on top of that is bits of brick rubble from the brick clamp, right up against the side of the church. So they were digging soil out for trenching to put a footer in for the church in early 18th century or mid 18th century. And that material was used to make brick right there on the spot. We have another drawing. Oh, here's a good view of it. So to the left-hand part of the screen, you can see brick rubble. This is the brick clamp over on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you could see, what is it, stratum 6F, is all that brick rubble and mortar that form the footer for the brick foundation on top. And this clamp is just, I don't have the scale on me here, but it's just a couple of feet from the foundation. And that's pretty typical. When we find these brick structures, often the brick clamp is within a few feet of the structure. Now you might think, oh, you're burning a brick clamp, isn't there a fire hazard? Well, keep in mind that the building you need the brick for probably hasn't been built yet, so there's nothing to burn. And you want to just minimize, movement of material. When I was a kid, I had two neighbors who were brick masons, and my elder brother and I worked for them. And so I've carried my share of brick. You want it as close to where you need it as possible. Just as sort of a contrast, I'm sorry, the right-hand side is kind of blurry. It's a blow up on the left-hand side, but this is in Allegheny County, and this is a large brickyard. They're still using some fairly simple, they're still making handmade bricks. It's fairly simple technology, but they're doing it on a much grander scale. And they're not using brick clamps, they're using brick kilns. That is, there's some sort of brick structure in place that they keep putting green bricks in, much like you would put pottery into a kiln. But it's still the same simple technology of packing mud into a form, turning that form over to get the bricks out, letting them dry, and then firing them. That kind of brick making, you would think, oh, so handmade bricks, so we can use those as a dating tool. We know that they were making soft mud bricks around here at the mouth of the Patuxent River and over on the Severn River, just here in where I am in Anne Arundel County. They were doing that up until 1900 or a little bit later. The Maryland Geological Survey recorded them having done so. And just here's a view of what's left of that brick factory. I mean, you've got a chimney stack for the kiln. It's sitting on a fairly substantial foundation. Here's just a close-up view of it. So this is more of an industrial scale, but the technology isn't that much changed. And you could just look at the brick that's used in it too, the variation in color. Uh, it's not enough of a close-up to see, but yeah, they're pretty well made bricks, but they're not the nice sharp-edged, even bricks that we get out of manufacturing today. So some of the morphology. First of all, you're packing that clay into the wooden mold, and that mold is probably going to be sanded for lubrication. Usually you're going to put in a handful or two of mud first, kind of push it, make sure you fill in the corners of this thing, and then you'll put the final handful or whatever in top. You push it down, and you'll scrape off the top, usually with a wooden stick, and that's called striking. So you strike off that excess clay. That striking leaves parallel grooves in the top of the clay. You can see those strike marks on soft mud bricks. When you turn the mold over and let the green brick drop out, even if you haven't used water as a lubricant, even if you've used sand, there's still going to be moisture in there, and it's going to create some suction. So when that brick comes out, that surface, the part that was on the wooden, flat wooden part of the mold, it's going to have a kind of an orange peel type texture to it, kind of dimpled. And that's from that surface tension created by moisture. It's really evident on those bricks that were, those molds where they used water rather than sand as a lubricant. So you're going to have two distinct surfaces. You're going to have the top part, which is the striking surface, and you're going to have the bottom part, which is going to have that dimpled texture, that dimpled surface. These are not red bricks. These are yellow clinker bricks, and these came from the Chase Lloyd House in Annapolis just a couple of years ago. I'll show you their context in a moment, but the top image is the striking surface. The bottom image is of that dimpled or irregular bottom part of the brick. The arrows on the top one point to the sort of groove along here. I think that's caused by when they were stacking the bricks, either while they were drying or perhaps while they're still a bit soft and they're being packed into a clamp. Yeah, I think that's all for this one. Here you can see it in side view, and this is the striking surface. Here it's got remnants of oyster shell lime mortar on it. The side view, and this is a little harder to see. Maybe I have it in the next image. Yeah, this shows up better. These arrows, you can see there's a sort of a curve here. That's a classic handmade brick because the initial load of clay gets pushed in to fill in the corners of the mold, and then you got this kind of coup de grace, that last bunch of clay that's pushed in to fill it out. And that leaves that very characteristic parabola in the brick, inside of the brick. And if you look at early brick buildings carefully, you will see that in a lot of them. You will see that curve. And that's dead to rights handmade brick. These are red bricks. And here again, it's a very smooth surface. If I zoomed in it, you hopefully might see the striations going parallel with the long axis of the brick. The bottom, I showed the side here because if you look at the lower right-hand corner where it's a close-up, you could see the little grains of sand. And when you check the sides of a brick, if you see those little grains of sand, but if, let's say the brick is broken and you look at that broken face, if you don't see that sand there, then this is a brick that was made in a sanded mold. That is, they use sand for the lubricant. And sometimes, yeah, if you look at the struck surface, the smooth surface, you tend not to see sand on that because there's no lubricant there. You see it on the bottom and the sides. So if you look close at the bottom, you look close at the sides, you'll see these little grains of sand. And if the brick is broken, you look at that broken face, you don't see that sand, and the sand has been mixed in as a temper, then that's what you've got, is you've got a sand-struck brick. So yeah, so just saying this the mold here would be sand. Here's a close-up of the top of that one brick, and you can maybe just barely make out the strike marks. Often they're much more evident than that. They're a little, it's not the best example for it, but you can see those striations. So again, this is a yellow clinker brick from the Chase Lloyd house in Annapolis. It's on King George Street. And I'll show you in a moment the context of it, but that yellow brick, that so-called clinker brick, they call it clinker bricks because they're really fired, they're more highly sintered, they're more hotly fired, they're more vitrified than the common red brick. And so they're pretty dense. They're relatively, when you hoist them in your hand, you can feel it kind of dense, they're heavy. It's a yellow brick because it was, the brick makers used clay that had a very low iron content or virtually no iron in it at all, mostly aluminum, magnesium, whereas a common red brick, as those that we make around here, is a lot of iron in the soil. And so that gives it that red hue. And it also, in many ways, makes a good brick, having iron kind of melt and be part of the structure of the brick. It also came from the Chase Lloyd house. But these bricks are illustrated about the same scale. So you can see the difference in size. The red bricks are a lot bigger than those yellow clinkers. Yellow clinker bricks were often referred to by archaeologists as Dutch bricks because the Dutch made yellow brick. And if you go to the Netherlands, you'll see lots of clinker bricks used in construction. You'll see them in Delaware. You'll see them in New York, especially up in the Albany area. So the Dutch did use these. But just because you find a yellow brick doesn't mean it's Dutch made. The Swedes also made them. But they do seem to suggest either, well, for around here, they're an imported brick. Now, whether imported from Europe or imported from one of the Dutch colonies, who's to say? But these were not the kinds of bricks that were made by most of the colonists here in the Mid-Atlantic. So here's the Chase Lloyd house at Maryland Avenue and King George Street, big mansion. The Hammond Harwood house is right across the street on the other side of Maryland Avenue, another mansion. This is kind of the mansion area of Annapolis. Well, a couple of years ago, the management at Chase Lloyd, they knew there was a buried oil tank next to the house, and they wanted to remove it. And so they did. And in doing so, they exposed this. This is part of a well. Now, when the oil tank was initially placed in the ground, whoever did that trenched through this area and destroyed a good part of the well, but this portion of it survived. Let me see if I have close up. Yeah, there we go. So here you could see that the upper part of this well shaft was laid in with common red brick. Now, still early, these are thicker than the kinds we typically see in the 18th century. But still, these are red brick, and below are the yellow clinker bricks. And I don't think it's two stages of construction. I just think they had a whole bunch of yellow clinker brick, which they used first, and then they built up from that with the more commonly available red brick. My guess is those yellow brick were either laying around, leftovers from a previous job, or were from cannibalizing a building that was demolished. Now, these bricks are inconsistent with the bricks that were used to build the Chase Lloyd house. And it didn't occur to me to supply a picture of the house, but it's a more classic 18th century construction, nicely made, even common red brick. And these are very different. To me, the presence of this well right next to the house, made with not only bricks we don't see used on the house, but also kind of a slapdash construction style that's inconsistent with the construction of the house, suggests to me that there was an earlier occupation on that lot. The Chase Lloyd house replacing an earlier building. And this well might have been made, was probably associated with that earlier building, not just because of the materials, but also the construction style is inconsistent with classic Golden Age brick mansion. I just wanted to throw in this example. I had no idea where I found this brick, but it is a handmade brick. It's got a lot of algal growth on it, but very sandy. So it's not just a sand mold, but I mean, I think they actually tempered the clay with sand. But it's got this large kind of prismatic indentation in it. This in the brick industry is referred to as a frog. Why they call it a frog, I have no idea. But it's made by inserting a piece of wood in the mold that the clay is pounded around and just leaves that impression. A lot of bricks made in the 20th century were made that way, only machine made. And two things happened. First of all, in that frog, the manufacturer might have the name of the company. But also the idea of the frog is that it ends up, the mason ends up using more mortar because you got to fill that big depression there. But it also locks the bricks into the mortar better. So the frog makes for a better construction. It uses less clay. It dries, and it fires more evenly because you've got more surface area in there. The heat gets to the interior more easily. It's a lighter brick. It's not so heavy to carry about. But the cost of that, of course, is you need to use more mortar to lay the bricks. Quick thing on handmade versus machine made. Look at the bricks here. It's from a site in Philadelphia, an image I stole from somewhere. But you can see the bricks, they're not all that even. You know, they don't look alike. You know, there's a lot of variation there. And so what the mason ends up having to do is use more mortar to kind of even them up, and thereby kind of create the illusion that the bricks are very regular, even when they're not. And that's important in the 18th century because they were really looking for regularity. They didn't want things looking organic. They wanted everything. They're trying to express rationality. This is the Enlightenment period. They're trying to express rationality in brick architecture. And again, in order to do that, they had to use thicker beds of mortar to kind of even everything up. You will often note on mansions of the period that have brick like this that they will line the joints. The joints are the mortar joints. And what the mason will do is draw, using a straight edge as a guide, score that brick joint before the mortar sets, creating a nice straight line. I don't have a picture of this right now. And so from a distance, the walls look a lot more, the masonry looks a lot more even than it really is. But it's an optical illusion caused by striking those joints. Later Romantic era type architecture, they'll often use kind of swirly lines to go out of the way to make it look irregular, but not so much in the 18th century. This is a more classic 19th and 20th century construction. Each of these bricks pretty much looks like the other. They're very smooth, they're very even in dimension. As a result, the mason has to use far less mortar. In fact, the less the better. If you start using too much mortar, making those joints too thick, you're going to give it that irregular, kind of naturalistic look, which is what they're trying to avoid. And I think I could see it here. I think I can't tell if these brick joints have been lined. I guess not. That's just a thin line of mortar through there. But these are machine-made bricks. They're early machine-made bricks in the mid-19th century. And finally, I thought I'd show you a couple of pictures of what you do with overfired bricks. They're all kind of warped and overfired. Um, my wife and I, Bonnie, we took a trip out to Pasadena, California, some years ago. We were there for a conference at Long Beach, an archaeology conference. Stayed a few extra days. We kind of wandered around Pasadena and Long Beach looking at arts and crafts architecture because we were interested in renovating our house and using that kind of style. And a lot of the buildings we looked at were by the Green brothers, Green and Green. But there are a wide variety of these buildings around town, and you could see with a close-up, it's more evident. Look at all these irregular bricks. I mean, they're not looking for something that's very rational and modern. It looks like they're almost going for a medieval look. Um, but sort of maybe Tudor with all Tudor style with all the heavy wood framing and the infilling or nogging of all these irregular bricks. And it's really quite attractive. I think it's a bit of a challenge for a mason to do this, but they even have these things going in at a diagonal, like brick nogging on a medieval or Tudor structure. Even around the walls and gates, these are overfired, these are over-sintered brick. And we even saw a mailbox post done this way with bricks sticking out in all kinds of crazy ways. They're really quite attractive. And, for over-sintered bricks, there's not a lot else you could do with them. And it's not like you could, turn them back into clay and try again. They're rubble. Here's a more regular example, but again, you can see the chevron type style infilling. And with the timber framing, it looks somewhat like Tudor or early Stuart architecture. The casement windows were also of that period. So, in terms of general chronology, the machinery for making bricks really starts getting off the ground in the 1840s, particularly in the Caribbean, where the U.S. was establishing fortifications on these islands and keys that really didn't, have good material, and they needed a lot of brick. And so they developed these bricks, and that's often the case. Military often does a lot to encourage technological innovation. But throughout the late 19th century, brickmaking became more rationalized, more mechanized, more capital intensive. The idea of making bricks at the site where we were actually going to use them is pretty much on the way out by the mid-19th century. We even start getting some small brickyards in the area. I know there was one in St. Mary's County, was that St. Andrew's Church Road, somewhere along that road, just south of Leonardtown. But we were still making soft mud bricks, aided by machinery, but soft mud bricks into the first decade of the 20th century. The industry, however, by then was already, especially out in the Midwest, was shifting towards extruded bricks. If any of you had those Play-Doh machines that I had as a kid, you put clay in it, you press this plunger, and the clay would extrude through a die so you could make all kinds of shapes. Well, that's how a lot of brick is made today. It's extruded, and as that ribbon of brick comes out of the machine, there's this stick that comes down with like a piano wire on it that just cuts through and cuts that ribbon into bricks. And when you find those bricks, if you look at each of the faces, you will see that's those strike marks, but unlike the handmade bricks, they'll be shaped as an arc. And so they were clearly cut by something coming down almost like a knife. So you've got those features. The other aspects of extruded bricks and machine-made bricks in general is the surfaces tend to be quite smooth, nice edge, sharp edges. I had something else here. What else? Oh, and a dense body. So they're being fired in kilns, usually gas-fired or electric kilns. So they're temperature is controlled very carefully. The heat is distributed very carefully. They're in there for a set time. I mean, they're very regular. You pick up a modern day brick and you think one brick looks like another. And that's not true when you're dealing with handmade bricks. So I think, yep, I think that's it. So I'm open to questions if you have any. Um, let me stop sharing.
And
Uh,
to add to that, if you have any questions, you can feel free to unmute and ask them, or you can also put them in the chat if that's easier for you.
Yeah, Jim, one of the coolest things I ever found was when you find a brick from that colonial period and it's got fingerprints in it from when they actually picked it up and, to lay it out to dry.
right. More often than not, you find animal prints, deer, raccoons, and that sort of thing. At historic St. Mary City, I think they've got one with an infant's footprint, and they have some with with thumbprints. That's not
Yeah,
unusual. That's actually from the brickmaker
right.
handling a soft brick. So you do find things like that, and they're kind of charming and interesting. Not sure there's much information value to those, but they're especially for exhibits. They're great things to use.
Yeah. It kind of gives that connection to the past kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. There's some humanity there. It's not just
Yeah.
the burn clay. There's people involved. It's like
Yeah.
finding early footprints in some of these early hominid sites. Yeah, there's something there, something conscious.
Yeah.
Any other
Jim,
questions? Mhm.
just a data point, it's Joanne. The James Bryce House in Annapolis was built with 325,000 bricks.
And that's a pretty big structure. That though is probably for the building itself. Doesn't include any additions, later additions, or walkways, or any of that sort of stuff. And that's what they say it used. Did anybody actually do a count? Who knows? We know that up at Whitehall, well, we think we know at Whitehall, that they were burning bricks for the mansion house there, which is private property. It's hard to get access to. It's actually it's the governor's mansion, but it's really it was then Governor Horatio Sharp's mansion, but it was really a very small building. And we know I've seen invoices in Annapolis for bricks purchased from Horatio Sharp. So it's very likely that what we excavated at Whitehall was also somewhat of a commercial enterprise where they're making bricks for use in Annapolis. And yeah, well, the 18th century stuff in Annapolis, the foundations are brick. A lot of the mansions are all brick. They used a lot of brick for the simple reason there's no stone available. It's either that or wood. Any other
Jim,
questions? Yes.
Jim, about brick making, the bricks in the 17th century come from Europe, but not the 18th century?
It's not that simple. Jamestown, Pinky Harrington found, I think, three brick clamps there.
I see.
The problem with brick in shipping them across the ocean is they're really heavy. So they have to go down in a hold.
Right.
The hold is where you take on bilge. So those bricks are sitting in salt water, absorbing water, which, for one thing, makes them really heavy to get them off the damn boat again. But also, those bricks are now impregnated with salts.
Right.
Those salts, when exposed to humidity, will expand and contract. When exposed to the cold and heat, they will expand and contract. And that will break down the structure of the brick. So shipping brick, number one, it's not the cheapest way of getting brick. The ships needed ballast. And so brick was probably okay for ballast, but I don't think it was a very good way of shipping merchantable brick. That
I
said,
agree.
we know that some brick was shipped across the ocean and used. We know this. We've seen invoices for it. But I think most brick was made here in the colonies on an as-needed basis. So, for instance, Charlotte Hall Academy in Charlotte Hall, when they planned on building the school, which I think the plans date back to the 1760s, they fired up a whole bunch of brick to build it. Now, for one reason or another, it wasn't built until the early 1790s, by which time people had stolen most of the brick that had been laid up, stored for it. So they had to make more brick. But that's just a classic example of purpose burned brick burned for a specific project. And usually the people making it were the building undertakers, as part of their contract. Now, they may have hired people who had experienced burning brick, but you wouldn't find too many professional brick burners in the colonies. At least I haven't, by looking through a number of sources. They just general workers working with the building undertaker. Anything else?
I had to smile.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just
Go
going to
ahead.
say, I had to smile when you were talking about Ivanhoe Hume, because I worked with a Seneca archaeologist who worshipped Hume and was big into dousing. So we used to douse all these sites that we were working on.
Noel was a funny guy. He had a great, he had your classic stereotypical British sense of humor, kind of dry, and did some wonderful exhibits around Jamestown, Williamsburg area. I can't remember the name of that museum. I think it's closed now, where there's an outdoor component to it. And there were these barrels at different sites. And when you push the button, Ivor Noel Hume's voice came out of the barrel. Yeah, with his characteristic humor and everything. But he was an opinionated guy. He was incredibly experienced, incredibly knowledgeable. But that quote came out of the book Historical Archaeology, that long-used textbook from 1968. Pretty sure that's the same book where he was saying that women didn't belong on archaeological sites.
Yes, I had a department chair who believed the same thing and quoted right from Hume.
Yep.
My BLM application letter of recommendation read, "I think Janet will make a very good archaeologist, even though she's a woman."
Yeah, well, you know what it is? Us men working without our shirts on would just distract the women. And of course, we'd always have to stop what we were doing and move wheelbarrows for them and stuff like that.
I'm sorry.
I had one woman working for me, Ann Hayward, who could easily bench press me. and I've had lots of women work with me over the years who, even if I offered to do something, would refuse outright. I mean, it was complete nonsense. And of course, it works the other way too. Women distract men, and but I guess the thing to point out here is that although he was one of the granddaddies of historical archaeology in this country, not everything he said should be, treated as gospel. Their opinions, not always well founded.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah.
I'm Richard Dodds, not Jane, as it says up there.
Yes, I recognize you, and I knew you weren't Jane.
We met when you came down to visit Christ Church, and I appreciate your mention of the clamp there. A question I've never found an answer to is that apparently when the church was last rebuilt in 1772, they used a number of short bricks or half bricks, probably half bricks. And to the extent that around 1908, when the church east gable wall had to be repaired, they basically took the whole wall down and rebuilt it. But part of the problem was these half bricks. Have you ever come across that before?
No, it sounds like I don't see a design reason for doing that, an engineering reason. It looks like somebody doing something on the cheap, using a bunch of what we call brick bats, half-bit bricks. The other possibility, I wasn't there, I didn't see this come apart, but it's possible the bricks were made rather poorly, and so when they took apart that wall, those bricks had broken. They were complete, but had fractured, and so they looked like brick bats. But no, I don't know. You know, you can use bricks in different shapes, and you can mold them in certain ways. You can rub them, kind of braid them to shape them, and make them in different sizes for some sort of decorative effect. But from an engineering perspective, there's nothing like a classic brick, and they varied somewhat in size over the years. Sizes were usually legally mandated. Whether or not that was enforced or not, it's another matter. And having just your regular bricks set in a bond, where you're alternating their orientation with each course, and that locks everything in, that holds it together. Using half bricks virtually makes that impossible. You can't bond the wall because all the bricks are too small.
Right.
That's going to be, that's just asking for trouble.
I don't know. Sorry, I didn't know it's related, but in that same area, when we removed some plaster that had fallen down inside the church on the northeast corner, lo and behold, we found pieces of iron, maybe about 3 feet long, flat iron that was set into the seam of the brick from the corner extending to 3 feet or so. Several of these. And I don't know how deep they went within the wall. You ever seen that or never heard of that?
That's a question for an architectural historian who's looked at stuff like that. I mean, presumably they had something in mind. It's not a general pattern. I haven't seen it elsewhere in my limited experience. It may have been just a local response to a particular problem, something they wanted to add to that wall, or they thought it needed reinforcement or somehow. I don't know, but no, I haven't seen that before. Now, when people find stuff like this, they need to document it really well, including the size and shape of what I assume is hand wrought iron. It's not cast or anything. That way, when we find fragments of stuff like that on other sites, we go, hey, we might have the same sort of thing going on here, even though it's no longer in place, the wall is long gone. But it's not unusual to find strap iron in amongst brick rubble, ruins of these sites. And, maybe it's a similar situation to what you described. Maybe it has absolutely nothing to do with the architecture. But we have no database, so no way to compare it.
Okay.
But the folks at the Maryland Historical Trust, they would be the ones to ask because they've looked at stuff like that.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
Sure.
So we do have a question in the chat where somebody asked, we have some bricks imprinted with the word Calvert. Can you tell us some history on these, dates, manufacturer, etc.?
Not off the top of my head, but obviously it's the Calvert Brick Works. I think that's the one that was down at Drum Point into the early 20th century. That's the southern end of Calvert County. Their bricks are all over the place. They're major producers. And in a Maryland Geological Survey report of, I think, around 1909, they say a few things about that operation, as they do about the one up on Severn River in Anne Arundel County, Severn Brickworks. But yeah, Calvert bricks are all over the place. It wouldn't take much research to find out. And I probably have that information somewhere. It's just not top of my head. I have a loose leaf binder full of all kinds of notes I collected because when I was still living on Long Island and when I was looking for a doctoral dissertation topic, and I was an industrial archaeologist, I was living at the east end of Long Island. The only thing we made out there were bricks. So I did a lot of research, and then I moved down to southern Maryland, down to St. Mary's City area, and no industry, but they made bricks. So I was collecting a lot of information. That was going to be my doctoral dissertation. Turned out Julie King recruited me to deal with the 17th century site. And the rest is mystery. Any other questions or comments? Critiques? Yes, that's it. Again, next month is the last one for this calendar year, and that's going to be on a late archaic site down near just west of Waldorf in Charles County. And it's neat stuff. I don't know what it all means yet, but we found some neat stuff.